Even when you meet with people, you do not laugh with them as is typical. You hardly greet them. You walk silently with each other. You keep going in opposite directions. Everything in the world taunts you because of the people who were killed by the enemies, your best friends, cousins. That weakens your body, and you feel like, what is my role here? Why should I laugh when many people have been killed and did not return from the raids? I'm Adam Hunt, and this is the Evolving Psychiatry podcast, rethinking mental health through an evolutionary lens. Share it with the people who matter, like it if you like it, subscribe if you want to hear more. Matt Zefferman is an assistant professor in the Department of Defense Analysis at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. His research uses mathematical models and ethnographic field research to understand human culture, cooperation, and conflict, especially in the context of political organization and war. The reason that I've invited Matt onto the podcast today is due to his fieldwork with Turkana pastoralist warriors in northwest Kenya. They have a very high degree of combat exposure, with around half of adult male mortality. So that's approximately 50% of adult men. The reason they die is due to combat in these cattle raids, which is just a staggering thing to think about. Matt has been interested in how Turkana organization for war has influenced their susceptibility to combat stress and moral injury. And he's interviewed hundreds of warriors about their combat experiences, moral beliefs about warfare, combat stress symptoms, and moral injury. Matt is also a US Air Force veteran with 6 years of service as a civil engineering officer with deployments to the UAE and Afghanistan. We're mostly here today to talk about Matt's work on PTSD in the Turkana, which he reported in a truly excellent paper published in PNAS in 2021. It really is one of the best examples in the academic literature of trying to look for psychiatric conditions and traits related to psychiatric disorder in sort of non-industrialized populations, and I can highly recommend reading the paper. It's also got some really excellent ethnographic work and interviews with people who are experiencing PTSD symptoms. I can really highly recommend getting into that. But before we get into that paper and talking about the Turkana and their symptoms, it would be really interesting to know a little bit about you, Matt, and why you got into evolutionary thinking, why are you concentrating on PTSD, what's your story here?
All right. Yeah, thanks, Adam. Thanks for inviting me on the podcast. I'm really excited to talk to you about this. One thing I should say before I forget is that as a employee of the Department of Defense, my views that I express here do not reflect those of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, Department of the Navy, or the Naval Postgraduate School. They're only my own. So you asked about my background. So as you said in your nice introduction, I was Air Force officer for 6 years after my undergraduate degree was in engineering. And then I got really interested in humans and why we do what we do. And as an engineer, I was a little dissatisfied with, a lot of the, I was an environmental engineer, so a lot of the environmental problems we were looking at, and realized a lot of the issues are about human behavior, not necessarily about the engineering, the physical engineering process. And I came across this book when I was a senior called Culture and the Evolutionary Process, which is this classic book by Rob Boyd and Pete Richardson about genes and culture and how they co-evolve, and decided that I wanted to learn more about that. And so after my military service, I got a PhD in ecology with Pete Richardson, who was one of the authors of that book. And during that time, did a lot of mathematical modeling. And specifically, my PhD work was on the evolution of warfare. And warfare is this kind of evolutionary puzzle in a sense, because some people take really high risks, including death, and for benefits to a group. And so it's kind of this classic cooperation problem. It had been, at that point, there was a little bit of interest in it from a kind of a straight up genetic evolution standpoint, but what I did for my dissertation was to look at it from a gene culture co-evolutionary standpoint. And then after that, I did mostly like theoretical mathematical work. And then while I was doing a postdoc, I had a postdoc doing mathematical biology at the National Institute for Mathematical and Logical Synthesis. While I was there, I was writing a paper with Sarah Matthew, who's an anthropologist who was actually one of Rod Boyd's former students, about the evolution of warfare. And she had gotten a Carnegie Fellowship to look at combat stress in the Turkana. And I had expressed to her my interest in getting into the field and getting out from behind the computer and out from behind the stack of books. And she gave me the opportunity to go down and do some field work. So I spent, a time, and I had no background in psychiatry, really more than any normal person. And so I spent a good amount of time trying to read as much as I could. A lot of psychiatry, as you know, is focused on treatments, and causes is less of a as an understatement, less of a focus. And so it didn't take I didn't have to get a whole clinician's degree to learn what I could. But there was a good amount of work in cross-cultural studies of combat stress in what's called medical anthropology and cross-cultural psychiatry or cross-cultural psychology. And so those were, they weren't evolutionarily framed, but those were really helpful to think about how culture influences these things. And also there was a book by Cantor that called Evolution of Post-Traumatic Stress that had kind of looked at PTSD from kind of like a evolutionary, using a lot of animal models, biological standpoint. And so that was kind of helpful from the evolutionary view. And so part of this was like trying to figure out how to, I guess, reconcile or combine this kind of, purely genetic evolutionary approach to PTSD and this kind of cross-cultural approach. And those were like the two places outside of like kind of mainstream psychiatry where people were looking at, causes and functions and things like that. And so, yeah, that's what I got interested. So it was like kind of quest for field work. And then this, these research questions really kind of grabbed my interest once I got involved in it. And part of it is like looking at it from my lens and I think Sarah's lens, which is this gene cultural coevolutionary lens, plus the evolution of cooperation, which I think had been not really part of the discussion about the causes of PTSD at the time.
Right. That lends some interesting context into something we'll kind of talk about towards the end of the episode about the kind of cultural, the rituals and the responses to combat stress, which have developed in the Turkana, and which maybe have some practical implications for understanding how to mitigate some of the costs of combat stress and trauma. Yeah, PTSD is a really interesting condition because it seems so obviously related to an external environmental cause. We really do know that there's some traumatic experience which causes this, and yet somehow modern psychiatry sometimes does just still look at the biological. If you look at like recent reviews, a lot of the Nature papers are kind of like, oh, what are the biochemical, what can you find in differences in heart rate and brain differences? And it seems so obvious that this is just an environmental response, almost by definition. So I think it's super cool to have the cross-cultural approach, and it's also really important for testing these evolutionary hypotheses. So very simply, the hypothesis which Cantor puts forward is that PTSD is just a defense kind of mechanism. It's if you're put through extremely stressful, extremely dangerous situations, you learn very quickly to be prepared in the future for situations like that. And then from that, you get all of these kind of extreme fear responses, basically, extreme alertness, being, hypervigilant, being startling easily, not sleeping, and essentially the idea is that this is all just to prepare you to prevent this kind of thing happening again in the future. So you went to the Turkana, which I mean I don't know if any other culture in the world has so much adult male mortality by in kind of warfare in these raids. It's like 50% is just incredible. So there must be very few places to kind of look for more PTSD. Could you give us a little bit of insight into kind of what Turkana life is like, how everything is kind of built around raiding? I mean, the paper goes into this in detail, but I think you tell the story really well there. Yeah. Could you...
I can talk about it. So one thing I should clarify is that that 50% mortality rate is, and this is kind of a minor issue, but it's in the communities that are close to where we did our field work. And so Turkana, there's probably there's probably around a million Turkana as the estimate, give or take. And so probably about 40 to 60% of the population Turkana are more traditional pastoral, live a more pastoral lifestyle, and then the rest live in more kind of sedentary in towns. And so in the area where we did our research was in a subsection of Turkana that is really close to the border of South Sudan, so about 40 kilometers from it's kind of a disputed border with South Sudan, but it's about 40 kilometers where the kind of current boundary is. And they live a pastoral lifestyle, which means that they make their living primarily off of raising sheep, goats, cattle, some camels, and some donkeys, which are mostly used for transportation. And they are semi-nomadic, which means that they travel with the seasons, where it's kind of a complicated. There's kind of a complicated decision-making process between where the best grass for the livestock is, and also avoiding conflicts. So there's kind of a seasonal flow to where people live, and they transport their belongings with them, including potentially what they build their shelters out of. And so the rating in this area, subsection of the Turkana, Sarah Matthew, who I worked with on this project, had done previous research and and found about 50% of adult male mortality was due to rating, and about half of that was offensively and about half of it defensively. So either Turkana raiding another group or being raided. And there are a number of groups around the section of Kenya, which borders Uganda, South Sudan. And the group where our field work was, the group that they primarily raid with is called the Tafosa, who are in South Sudan. And so Turkana men would go across the border to South Sudan and try to raid cattle and come back. And there's kind of two main types of raids. One is we call stealth raid, which is a group of 5 to 12 or so men, normally younger, about the same age, who will get together and go try to sneak across the border and get some cattle, and they're trying to avoid conflict. They're trying to sneak and sometimes, or find some cattle that are like loosely guarded. And then there's also these battle raids, which Sarah did a lot of her initial field work understanding, which is where you could get groups of hundreds of Turkana men from different age groups that go, and they kind of are big enough a group that they're inevitably going to come into conflict. And and they have tradition. I interviewed some older men who back in their day had spears and things like that during the raids, but now since the 70s it's been small arms. Not a lot of ammunition, which is good, but they do carry small arms, and so most of the battlefield deaths are due to small arms fire, bullets and things like that. And so, and also in the just highlighting the combat exposure. In our I did interviews with 160 so Turkana men, and about half of them had visible bullet wounds from these raids. And so even of those that survived the raids have battle injuries. And you can imagine in this area, I mean, they're going on these raids by foot, and so they're going maybe 100 kilometers round trip. And so you can imagine that people who do get shot and injured don't survive most of the time. And so it's pretty intense. A lot of combat exposure in this population. Yeah.
It was interesting reading your paper because, I mean, as a sort of like a young man who might be in the situation of, I could imagine. So basically you paint this picture of how raids are kind of organized, and people go around from camp to camp and talk about, oh, we're planning a raid. Do you want to get in? And you'd have kind of cousins and friends saying, hey, should we go on a raid? And it's like a huge part of their culture to kind of to build up to these raids, right. Organize them. You get kind of blessings. There are dances of people. It's like sending you off to kind of war in some sense, but it's like a lot of the culture is
Right.
that, and it sounds and it's much more personal, right? It's not you're not being recruited by a random face on a TV screen.
Right.
You're being recruited by your friends who are, maybe young men who are trying to kind of gain some status and become, respected warriors, gain cattle, and it's sort of it's really part of their culture to actually engage in these raids, and that's sort of the way they hopefully get more cattle and then kind of prosper. And then they're in these antagonistic relationships with these other groups who then are trying to raid them and probably have similar cultures around raiding. Yeah, and it's interesting how kind of deeply ingrained it is in the culture, and it's the thing that you do basically. Is kind of prep for a raid, and then when you come back from a raid, then everyone talks about it,
Yeah.
and there's all these stories of of success or failure, and it's really yeah, it's I can see the why it would be so tempting to do that when, even though 50% of you end up dying in those raids, still somehow the culture is
Yeah.
kind of keeping this alive, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
The
There are a lot of sorry.
No, go on, yeah.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, there are a lot of social norms around raiding too. I mean, so there's individual incentives, right? You get cattle if you go on the raids, but as far as um, you guys you were alluding to, there is a lot of status that's gained by going on raids and being successful with cattle. And also, we talked about in the paper is unlike the U.S. military, there is kind of a special status given to those who've killed in combat, either offensive or defensively, and which isn't something you see in Western militaries a lot. Um, and yeah, and one other thing too is that the Turkana are on the receiving end of raids from other groups too, including the Toposa, and so everyone in the society of any age has experienced some sort of raid, or had family members that have had it, and so unlike say U.S. soldiers or military members who go to far-flung wars and come back home to civilian or mostly civilian life, the Turkana come back, and they might not be during a raiding season, there might be not raids going on, but they're surrounded by community members who um, understand the impact of it, right? And so it's a little bit easier for them to just have conversations about their experiences. And definitely the men um, do sit around quite a bit telling stories, and a number, often the stories are about raids. Even the old men are talk about their younger days raiding and stuff. And so it's just kind of, there doesn't seem to be a lot of a stigma associated with talking about the good and the bad, mostly bad about going on raids. So,
Right, yeah. Right, so I think that, yeah, it makes sense to kind of think about that as such a core part of the culture, and then they have this kind of ongoing these ongoing raids, and then out of that, as you would expect, if PTSD is a sort of adaptation responding to extreme circumstances that kind of is meant to defend you against those things in the future, you see all of these symptoms associated with PTSD. So, so when you're kind of going around the Turkana and asking people about PTSD, yeah, actually, I might just read, because you have so many good quotes in the paper. I might just kind of quickly read some of the quotes that you have in there, which are really, it's all very well. You have this kind of quantitative side where you compare the symptoms of PTSD in the Turkana with American veterans, but you also tell the stories from their point of view, which really, I think, cements this idea of what it's like for them. So I kind of talking about the nightmares. One Turkana said, "After all that happened in the raid, I experience nightmares every day whenever I go to sleep. Sometimes I wake up from the dream shouting with anger, yelling insults, and acting like I was fighting the enemies. It's when I woke up that I realized what I was experiencing was not real, and I was dreaming of what in fact had happened in the battle. Heavy exchanges of fire in the battle stuck in my head, and I could hear the sound of guns while sitting with other people. I was disturbed by these dreams for 2 good years. That is the wet and dry season according to our calendar. The dream keeps disturbing me because of the wrath that fills my heart, not even the matter of being cowardly. The painful incident of the raid hurts my heart even right now as we speak. I am restraining myself like a man." Um, so when you were sitting with these warriors and interviewing them, I mean, what
yeah.
was that like? Could you? Yeah. Just talk me through that. I mean,
Yeah. So the yeah, so there was yeah, so I talked to 100. I'll just stop for this. So I talked to, like I said, around 100, 160 or so warriors, and I wasn't involved in all of the interviews, and so the way that just logistically the field season work is I went out over 3 2-month field seasons. Basically, it's during the season when the Turkana, it's the rainy season, so Turkana are not up in the hills where there's a lot of conflict. They kind of come out where there's grass in the valley, and so there's just for safety reasons they're separated from the potential to be raided while I'm there, and also the grazing's easier, so there are more people congregate more, so it's a little easier to find folks. And so while I was there, I went out for the first 2 months with I don't speak Turkana, or I speak definitely not enough to conduct interviews at the level that you just quoted from. So that's an English translation from Turkana. And so I worked with a number of really amazing field assistants that Sarah had recruited with her field manager over the years, and specifically one at Kiru the first time. And we went out and did a lot of piloting, so a lot of translation, cross translation with a group that wasn't in the high rate areas, and we went out and the first field season was semi-structured, and so that meant would ask questions and said, "Oh, could you tell me about this experience?" And they would um, respond, and then Ikiru would translate to me, and I'd write it down. And after that, and then adjust the question. So like most of our questions were good. One story is that I was asked about questions about nightmares, which is like the quote you just read, and was talking to one the participants, and he started talking about how he had this dream that he won this raid, and they won lots of cattle, and he came back, and everyone's very happy and celebrating. I was like, this doesn't sound like a bad dream to me. It sounds like a good dream. And it turned out that we had put dream in there and not specified a bad dream, and so in the translation. And so at that point, everyone had described bad dreams. So we had one person who had a good dream, and so then we had to go and modify. So that was during the pilot phase, and that's when I really got like the firsthand discussion. And then after that, I still participated in a lot of the interviews, but it would help resolve questions. But we had a field of researchers that would go out and interview people based on the refined survey instrument. And the interviews lasted anywhere, or depending on the experiences of the person and how verbose they were, they would last probably, I think our shortest interview was probably 45 minutes, and the longest was probably 6 hours. And so it's
wow.
we asked lots of questions and try to get a lot of ethnographic detail, and we ended up recording a lot of the responses and then going back and translating them back into English just to make sure we captured, that long quote that you read was from a Turkana response to a survey, recorded and then translated back into English. And that's really the only way kind of to capture that kind of richness of detail. Other than just me trying to scribble notes in English translation, you kind of lose a lot of the fine-grained detail from that. So that's kind of what we're. And so it was like actually kind of hard for me to, I was there for most of the surveys, but once we became more of a, the research assistants were leading it, I, it was hard. I could get kind of sense of the emotions of the people, which is also very difficult because I have a very, United States American kind of way of interpreting emotions, and I was not always very accurate about what people were emotions were going on, which is why when you do this work, you need to have people with that kind of local experience, because the field research could be like, hey, this person's very upset right now, and we take a break from the survey, and I wouldn't notice that necessarily, and so
Oh,
there's
that's
that.
interesting.
But I think like really for the fieldwork side, I mean, there was the formal survey we did, but I learned a lot more about the Turkana, in the semi-structured interviews we did, but just, after the day was done and just sitting around and like socializing, and like just talking to people. And so, with the help of the research assistants. And so one of them, like when I first got into the field, in a conversation with, a group of young men, and they were just asking me questions about, what my life was like outside of field work, right? And so like, oh, how many children do you have? And at the time I didn't have any. And then, well, who watches over your animals if you don't have any children? And I was like, well, I only have 2 cats. I don't have, cows and stuff. So it became, there's like series of questions that help me just by the asking, help me realize, like how many wives do you have? Like you only have one wife, and I was like, oh, we only have one wife at a time in my my society, and then oh, so what is that? And so it's just like you learn a lot about um, the I learned a lot about the society, like almost just from getting asked questions and just realizing, kind of the assumptions underlying those questions. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's kind of what worked. And we were just logistically, we were um, out in living in tents in a local community. Luckily, there was a place where the government had established a kind of a pharmacy there, and there was a kind of a research farm there, and we were able to set up shop there, and there was a water tank that they filled periodically, and so we were able to set up shop there, and then either interview people as they came through or go out and try to find people where they were settled and talk to them there, and so it was pretty good, and we actually had a really high response rate. I think it was about 98%, something like that, of people talk to us,
Wow.
which is really uh, considering how much time these interviews took was actually pretty surprising to me, how what our response rate was. And so it was you know it was a convenient sample, like it was people that we came into, but it was pretty good to get these. And we only talked to people who had been on raids or had been involved in raids. So there were some people that we didn't interview because they were too young and hadn't really experienced anything like that.
I wonder if it's partly because so much of the culture is talking about raids, and you're there to talk about raids. Like if you were talking
Yeah,
about
yeah,
other symptoms like depression, or and like people don't care, but like sharing the stories is so
yeah. I
yeah,
think
it's
so. I
such
think I think a lot of the men. I mean, once you're a man of a certain age, their children are watching the cattle most of the time, and so it's like fairly easy, or it's easier for them to sit for a long time and talk. And I think it also just like the novelty of it, right? And so someone asking all these questions about because there's not necessarily a conception of like there's this thing called post-traumatic stress, right? So like I ask a lot of questions about the raids, and then I ask all these questions about like, oh, do you have nightmares, and did you have um all these different things going on, and I think there's just like some novelty involved. And we also, I mean, we um Sarah, like we don't pay participants, at least we didn't for the study. And Sarah had been doing research there for a long time and had a kind of established reputation as someone who is helpful for the community. So we had brought solar panels and would charge people's um, phones if they had
uh,
them. And we would, we got there, we had, goat, had a goat roast. And when we left, there was a goat roast. And we gave people rides to, if someone got injured or sick, we would give them rides to the local clinic, which was probably 10 kilometers or 20 kilometers away on some pretty bumpy roads. And so we tried to do as what we can to help out the community. And so I think we had Sarah and our field researchers, and I to some extent had built up some goodwill over time.
so the PTSD. I mean, you say that they don't have a concept of PTSD, um,
Yeah.
which is interesting because they have several rituals which we'll talk about then very soon, which seem to be kind
Right.
of maybe aimed exactly at what PTSD is. But they don't
Yeah.
have the name, and I wonder if that's just like there's a Western thing. If we decide to label the
Yeah.
internal state, and they are like, oh yeah, that's the thing that we do this ritual for, and the ritual is the thing that you name. Um,
Yeah. So in the medical anthropology literature, there's this concept called idioms of distress, which is kind of the term that is uh, I'm probably not going to give the exact definition, but the way that I understand it is different societies have different ways of expressing distress of different ways, right? And so it might be variable across societies, and their kind of view is that you kind of take, unlike like our research, and I think this is super valuable, is that you go in and you kind of ask people, well, like, hey, if someone's distressed, what happens to them? Um, it's hard to do the cross society comparisons like we try to do in our paper when you do that, because you get very different answers depending on where you are, and there's that. And so I think there are some idioms of distress with the Turkana, but I think you're getting at it where it's the label of post-traumatic stress disorder. Um, there's a good book about this, which I'm by Finley, which I'm not remembering the name of right now, but it's talks about the origins of PTSD and in the DSM, and so it comes down to that people are coming back from Vietnam, and had medical issues, you were having the problems that we associate with PTSD now, which are similar to things like shell shock from previous um, previous wars, or railroad spine from even earlier eras. Right, there's some overlap in these concepts, but then it's like, okay, in order to get these veterans treatment, you need to have some sort of medical disorder to tie this to, right? And so that was kind of and there was a lot, big lobbying effort by people treating veterans and by veterans themselves to try to get this collection of symptoms um, uh, classified in the DSM. And that's kind of so there's this, like, this goes into this kind of like political, historical, and there's a big debate about like how much of PTSD even now in the fifth edition of the DSM is kind of a byproduct of just what specific things Vietnam veterans were suffering from, and the societal kind of ideas about that, which is really interesting literature. I mean, when you're thinking about culture, too, is like looking at these things through this. And so, Turkana don't have any of this. There's no DSM in Turkana, right? So people have these ideas, and there's these rituals, like you said, and we try to do a little bit of asking, hey, what do people who come back from war who don't, or who have these experiences, specifically killing, what happens if they don't do these rituals? And like most people do it, so it's like really hard. It's really hard to say, but also there was a lot of discussion about like physical ailments, like they wither away, they lose all their strength, things like that.
Mm.
So yeah, and that's very interesting too.
Right.
And as we saw in the paper, like some of the symptoms of the classic of the standard DSM symptoms of PTSD seem to be at really low rates in the Turkana, or even like really hard to ask about. So in DSM, there is one of the symptoms of PTSD is this reckless behavior. Reckless or risky behavior? How much have you been engaging in that? How much has that been bothering you? Which is the addition, one of the things that was added in DSM-5. And man, we tried so hard to come up with a way of asking that question, asking about that symptom. We tried so many different ways, translating it, and it just didn't seem like that was a category, a generalizable category of risky or reckless behavior that we could communicate in Turkana. Either we just did a bad job of trying to figure out, or just doesn't exist as a category. And so there's these kind of like differences in how we categorize things. Like we could give like specific examples, like, oh, these are some examples of risky behavior, and they would say like, no, I've never done that, or yeah, I've done that one. But to try to generalize to a broader category, we had a really hard time. And I think that's in the paper too, is like a footnote. It's like, yeah, this one we're not sure about. Maybe it's just like uncommon enough that there's no need to have a category, or maybe it's because a lot of behaviors are inherently risky. And so like the idea of risk is just very different, or maybe just risk is like a kind of a economics term, that's hard to think about in terms of like problem, I don't know. So
Yeah. No, I can kind of see that. Yeah, so I actually have the specific quote for you about. So there's the three rituals that you mentioned. I'm going to butcher the names, but maybe you can say them better. But it's Akiga, Akipur, and Nikitibus. Is that?
Yeah. It's like Akiger. I'd say, and I'm probably a Turkana person, probably say I'm not pronouncing it right either, but it's like Akiger, Akapur, and Nitabus. And
Nitabus.
that normally people understood that well enough to know what I was talking about if I pronounced them that way. So, so there's three rituals, and so there's like Akiger is optional, right? And so what Akiger is it's specifically for people who have killed in combat, and the way it works kind of has varied over the years, but essentially it's a ritual scarring. So someone who's killed in combat is able to scar their body. So if you've seen Black Panther, the Marvel movie, there's a character in there, Killmonger, who has these scars on his body. That's kind of what it looks like. It's not like you get in that movie. I think they get one scar for everyone they've killed. That's not how it works with Turkana, but I think that movie, a lot of the aesthetics of that movie are based on Turkana, and that specific scarring is very similar looking to the Turkana scars, these kind of small raised bumps. That is an option. If someone who's killed, that's an optional thing they can do, and it kind of advertises like, hey, I'm someone who's killed in battle. And that kind of like designates some bravery, because you have to actually engage in battle to be able to do that. But as we argue in the paper, it also signals us of social support. So we asked a lot of people, how do you feel about someone who has that, has these scars. And most people had very positive, associations with someone who has those scars. Not everyone does the scars; it's completely optional. And we asked a lot of people who didn't do it why they didn't do it, and reasons were various because it hurts a lot, and it does. You're slicing you know, slicing your skin. We got some people who were concerned that if to post a because there's during times of peace to post a Turkana or have relatively friendly relations, that they might be targeted because they have these scars. And some people just say like I didn't feel like doing it or whatever, it was a pain. So, but good, especially the older men, a lot of them have done it. There's also Akapur, which is a purification ritual. And that one is pretty much mandatory for people. By that, I mean, no one's going to make you do it, but pretty much everyone does it for anyone who's killed an enemy in combat. And if you ask people what happens if someone hasn't done this Akapur ritual, they say that they weaken and slowly waste away if they don't do it. And this one, one thing about this is like this ritual, and actually all three of these rituals are only, they're done as a group. It's not something you do by yourself, and they're only done with other people who have killed in combat. So only people who have gone through this can help with the ritual. And the details vary, but it normally involves killing an animal, taking off for Akapur. You remove the clothes that you wore in combat. I mean, they don't have large wardrobes because they're pastoralists. So you take off your clothes and you get a fresh set of clothes that people donate, and you wear those from then on. And there's various other aspects of this ritual ceremony. The other one, Nidabus, is often at the same time as Akapur. And this one is specifically protects you from the ghosts of anyone that you killed in battle. And, because people do seem to get haunted by people they've killed. And this is supposed to ward that off. And why this is kind of a separate ritual is because if someone goes through this, if they feel like they're being haunted by someone they've killed, they can do it again. I think I said maybe mentioned in the paper that there, one participant who was an older man said, over about 20 years, he had done this ritual 11 times because he kept on getting haunted by the ghosts. And so you might think that this, which often happens during a dreaming state, like someone's asleep and they feel like they're being haunted, but also a waking state. So you can imagine potentially there's a lot of guilt associated with this that are that's coming to the fore, and this ritual helps, at least in theory, suppress that. And so kind of the argument we make in the paper is that what these rituals do is you have this kind of morally ambiguous thing, which is killing. In Western societies, it's kind of or at least in the US, it's kind of an issue because you kind of grow up and killing's bad, right? You don't want to kill people. It's very basic moral principle. But then you go off to war and you potentially are killing people, right? And then people come back and they're conflicted about this. And this gets into a different paper we wrote about moral injury, which is kind of these like things or witness things that we normally consider immoral in combat, and then you come back to the civilian world and you have potential issues about that. And so we make this argument that this kind of hauntings, this kind of wasting away, are potential consequences of doing something that's morally ambiguous. But then you have these rituals that maybe signal to you that, hey, you're socially accepted when you do this. Like these are these people are here to support you. We're going through this elaborate ritual to kind of help you out. For Akagir, you have these scars that people can see, and they express potentially positive feelings towards you because of these scars. And one thing about this is it's not all about bravery. So we have in the U.S. military, we have a lot of rewards. They're like Congressional Medal of Honor. That's like you did something very brave. You maybe took the ultimate sacrifice or took a lot of risk to help out people. Your selfless behavior. We have that in Turkana. Have that to some extent. They also, in Sarah's previous work, have sanctions and punishment for cowardice. But because this is something that's more of a moral issue about killing someone on the enemy, which is potentially good for your side in war, that it's more of a social. You might have this kind of evolved wanting to avoid the social consequences of doing something like that, and these signals of support maybe help overcome that, which may be why the paper is we found that kind of the symptoms of PTSD associated with depression were lower in Turkana relative to these other symptoms compared to American veterans.
Right. So that was the main kind of finding of the paper, right? That's the abstract is, a lot of these symptoms appear, a lot of these symptoms that are associated with what seem like the defense, the hypervigilance, the startling, the nightmares. All of those seem pretty high in Turkana, but Turkana don't express the same sort of low mood, lack of emotion, basically depression-like symptoms that you see in US soldiers. So there's something interesting there where when we're looking at PTSD, and I think those depression-like symptoms are actually part of the qualifying criteria for PTSD in the DSM, right? They're category
Right.
5 or something like that.
That's right.
So the Turkana wouldn't technically
Yeah.
classify as PTSD if they don't have those depressive symptoms. I mean, maybe the insomnia would kind of count, but it doesn't really. It's not. But no, mostly it's about like lack of emotion, um, loss of interest, um, and that just didn't happen, which is really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, insomnia is kind of a weird one. So, I mean, we in the paper break out things differently than DSM, and it turns out there was like after we had submitted the paper, um, it had turned out that there is a alternative. So the DSM classifications are based a little bit on like intuition, but also on factor analysis, like statistically looking for clusters of correlations of symptoms, which if you is common in psychology. It's like to find underlying factors. And so, but there's another uh, classification that does like fairly similarly on factor analysis as the DSM that also breaks out things very close to how we did based on kind of our breaking out. And the way we broke it out, just to clarify, is based on this kind of functionalist evolutionary argument about like if you have ideas that there are um, kind of evolutionary functionalist reasons for these different symptoms, like what function might they serve, and then how would they cluster together based on that function. And so we had that there's like some symptoms about learning about kind of fearful or traumatic experiences, which are from actually very similar to Cantor's book. Is about what you were talking about earlier, which is uh, you know maybe cross species, at least mammal type symptoms. So like there's things like memories and flashbacks that might help you learn about these traumatic experiences and avoid them in the future. And then there's these reacting ones like hypervigilance and increased startle, right? So those maybe other animals have these types of things, right? And so that kind of is like from the Cantor book. But in his book, and I think it's generally true, like some of these other symptoms are a little bit harder to explain, at least like to at least explore with animal models, which are like these like what we call depressive symptoms, which are things that overlap a lot with depression. So like emotional numbing, having negative feelings and beliefs about the world, loss of interest in activities you used to enjoy. So we talked to warriors who'd say like, I used to enjoy dancing, these ritual dances. I used to, but now I just don't want to anymore, right? So it's kind of like these things are similar to depression. Um, but there are also things like insomnia where it's kind of a mix, right? Insomnia could be both depression and you're thinking a lot about the raid. And so those are things that came out. And we did find that like relative to the other symptoms, like Turkana had these things associated with depression for the most part at much lower rates than things like hypervigilance and startle response and things like that.
Right. I mean, there is actually one good quote on the numbness side of depression that I think I might just quickly read from the paper. Um,
Yeah.
Even when you meet with people, you do not laugh with them as is typical. You hardly greet them. You walk silently with each other. You keep going in opposite directions. Everything in the world taunts you because of the people who were killed by the enemies, your best friends, cousins. That weakens your body, and you feel like, what is my role here? Why should I laugh when many people have been killed and did not return from the raids? And this actually speaks to something else that was quite interesting that you found, which is that these PTSD symptoms were much more likely to be associated with, or significantly more likely to be associated with unsuccessful raids where it was kind of like generally judged as a failure and more people died and the cattle were either lost or you weren't able to gain them. And if you had a successful raid, then people were much less likely to experience these symptoms, which makes a lot of sense, right? Like if you have it's even though it's still a battle, actually battles can be very successful and they don't have to be traumatic, and you probably don't have to turn on your hypervigilance defense kind of fear response in the same way as going through these very close misses. And you had a load of examples. I would really highly recommend people to read not only the paper but the supplementary material where you have so many of these quotes. And then so often people are talking about how they were sure that they were going to die. You know, they were so close to death, and everyone was dying around them, and they wonder why they survived when their friends didn't. And that's and which also rings true of a lot of the reports from PTSD vets in the US. There's this sort of survivor guilt kind of aspect, and it's kind of, it makes a lot of sense why those very near misses are the things which would make you really, really keyed up and kind of not sleeping and being very cautious. There's actually one other really good quote around hypervigilance, which I think is good to mention. So after the raid, I became super alert. Whenever I go to the forest, I monitor my movements. When I'm in an insecure place, I don't step on the bare soil. I step on the shrubs and logs. This is because I don't want enemies to discover my footprints and follow me to where I went. While herding, I never sit down and remain in the same place. I'm always keen and alert. And you can just very clearly see why, this is, I mean, it's maybe an exaggerated, but it's like a defense behavior, right? And you eventually you will be better at protecting yourself if you follow all of these things. And going through these extreme experiences are just going to force you to protect yourself. I think it's very revealing.
Yeah, we did ask participants, like, for each symptom whether they thought they were helpful or not, right? Because we have the assumption these are all negative, right? And so the ones that they did find were helpful was that one, like being hypervigilant. That one, a lot of people said, like, yeah, I'm hypervigilant, that's good. because it's keeping me safe, right? Not as hypervigilant as, which just, maybe this is, something that if you come back to the United States, being hypervigilant is maladaptive because you're in a fairly safe place. But if you're at Turkana, maybe it is, good to be hypervigilant, or helpful. And the other one was kind of for a different reason. There's a symptom like avoiding intrusive memories, and like people thought it was good to try to avoid intrusive memories, right? Because there's ideas like, I'll just forget about, I'm trying to forget about what happened, and that's probably good, right? And so it's a little bit not necessarily a clinical treatment in Western psychiatry, where some types of treatment you want to like try to remember as much as possible and kind of become immune to these thoughts. They kind of felt that was good. But yeah, definitely that hypervigilance was the one where not everybody, but a good number of people thought was a good trait to have, not a bad one.
That's interesting because in the last few days I've been looking at videos of Americans talking about their PTSD, and actually some of them talked about their hypervigilance as a positive thing, that they recognized they were kind of, even though it wasn't appropriate for the situation, they are just being, they're trying to defend their family, they're watching out, like, even though it's not going to happen. But then when they hear the car backfire and then they're suddenly alert and you feel the adrenaline, like, you can see why that's it's an adaptive response. So even without the evolutionary framing, people recognize that this is just me. I've been through these experiences, this kind of thing can happen to me. Now my brain is just wired to that in a different way, which makes a lot of sense. So kind of getting onto this aspect of what do we do? How do we help people? It's super important to understand these traits from an evolutionary perspective, I think, obviously. I mean, there's kind of implications in your work looking at the kind of cultural norms surrounding the response to violence and killing, that like some of it can be somewhat ameliorative of certain symptoms. How do you think about this in the context of PTSD today?
Yeah, so I mean, I should start by saying, like, I have no clinical training, and so I'm always a little bit uncomfortable talking about treatments because I feel like there's a certain credential amount of training you're supposed to have. So put that caveat in there. I do think that there potentially are implications. I do think that maybe things like hypervigilance and increased startle response and these kind of fear-based responses, right? As far as cross-culturally, potentially they're just kind of I don't want to say universal, but probably maybe near universal. Right? It's hard to say comparing Turkana just to the U.S. or whatever, but there's an N of two. So I do think looking in more places in more different diverse types of societies is potentially important to kind of figure out the variation. And there's just like a lot of ways Turkana are different. Being a Turkana person is different than being an American person. So causation could be lots of different things, but kind of the ideas we had is, these rituals are pretty interesting in a sense, as far as, maybe these depressive symptoms or even moral injury, specifically around that they're about killing, this morally ambiguous event. And so that's, like I mentioned earlier, that doesn't seem to be something that the United States military has. Like maybe you get a medal or some recognition because you did something in battle that might have involved killing, right? So that might happen, but not specifically like, hey, we just came back, this thing happened that you might be really upset about, what are we going to do about it? And so, maybe having a ritual for that would be good. I think that, it, some of this conflicts with US norms. So like, this idea of like, oh, I'm going to ritually scar myself. So I, you know, show that I killed in battle, like that maybe you don't want to have that kind of encouragement, right? So there might be some trade-offs here between the individual event and not. And so it's hard to say, but maybe having something that recognizes um, the moral implications of doing something like killing or something else in battle might be useful. That would be from other, your peers, like
Right.
want to do, the peers that have also gone through this who understand it. I think that might be useful, and it probably wouldn't be the same as a Turkana ritual, which is very tied to that particular culture and society. But there might be something that could be, I would imagine, be like innate and grow up with the people who experience it. That would have some potential meaning for them. So there's that. I do think also, there are some studies. One of Sarah Matthews' current graduate students, Michael Baumgartner, is looking at. Michael Baumgarten is looking at studies with American veterans. And some of the things that he's come across is that it seems to be that people that are in that engage in combat, that are in something like the Air National Guard or the National Guard and the Reserves, which are here, are civilian units that get activated and during Iraq and Afghanistan go to war, as opposed to an active duty military unit that goes and comes back, might have more PTSD symptoms, maybe because they just go back to their civilian lives and they don't have this time to come back to their military base and interact with people and have conversations and stuff. There's some treatment that's getting veterans together to talk about their experiences, right? And those that seem to be helpful in some cases. And so things like that might be similar to the Turkana, right? It's not necessarily all of society. It's not like your spouse and your family members who potentially don't have military service can relate. But getting veterans together to talk about things might become some way towards having this type of social support that they have. And
Something interesting. Sorry, yeah, there's something interesting there as well in the communal aspect, which is quite different to just going to a single therapist who you don't know, or like a psychiatrist.
right,
And you're just, it's a person you've never met before, and then you're meant to talk about your feelings, and that's just so different to going back to your community and everyone kind of coming out and showing that they accept you and that they support you, what you've done, and they're here for you now, and you've done a great job, and you're a hero of sorts. I think that there's a lot of areas of Western psychiatry which do often rely on this one clinician who is not part of your peer group really. But
right,
that's very different to the social support which you see in basically all healing rituals in non-Western societies, which are purely
yeah,
communal with like some respected elder or shaman or whatever, but also with your family and friends. And that
yeah,
seems like a very clear difference.
yeah. That's a good point. Yeah, that'd be interesting. I've looked at the PTSD, combat stress specifically, but yeah, it's interesting to think about that kind of across rituals and societies. Is that we do have this kind of professionalized clinician, right? That's like, even if you have places that have there's some interesting work on shamanism and things, and the shamans type figures in Turkana, as far as I know, don't have much to do with these rituals, but in some societies they potentially do. But yeah, you're right that like these things tend to be communal. It tend to be a lot of people involved, not just one clinician and one person, these symptoms. And so yeah, there might be something to that. Just as a general principle, that might be interesting to look at that more.
So, I mean, you're not a clinician, you don't work with veterans, but
Right.
But you are a veteran, so
Right.
uh, so I don't know if that makes you more or less qualified. Um,
Well,
but
I do understand. And, I teach at a military, my students are all military members. And I personally have not, I'm a veteran, but, I deployed to Afghanistan, but I, was not involved in any combat. So I don't have those kind of direct experiences. But, I do kind of understand the military organization and culture on average better than most, I guess.
yeah, I just assume that the Turkana would think it would be very weird that we don't have that you go off the war and then you're just sitting in your, as you kind of talked about, like
Yeah.
this society which basically is untouched as well. People can't really appreciate you because they're not being raided by the enemy in the same way.
Yeah.
There's no like eye for an eye element there, which is what often drives warfare or motivates it. It's like these people have attacked us and we're trying to get them.
Yeah, yeah, there's a little bit. So there's a little bit of revenge talk. But it's actually, if you ask people like what's the top line reason why you engaged in raids, it's to get animals. Like that's number
Right.
one. There are a few people in our data set who were more motivated by rage, but revenge was pretty rare. And revenge often, I didn't do a huge study of this, but just anecdotally, it seems when people talk about revenge, it's against specific individuals more so than collective revenge. So it's not like, hey, the Toposa raided us, we're going to go get them back. It's more of like, um, the Toposa raided us, and this specific Toposa person killed my brother, and so I'm going to seek that person out. And if I saw that person on battle, or maybe even during non-war time, if I ran into that person, I might extract revenge or kill their brother or something like that. Right. So it's not necessarily this like collective revenge. It's you just anecdotally, it when people talk about it with me, it seemed like more driven at specific people. Though I didn't do a big study on revenge, so I might be missing some nuances there.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. So, I mean, I think that well, a couple of the key takeaways are it seems very obvious for PTSD that like it's hardly controversial that this is some sort of adaptive response to an extreme situation that is teaching you about um, averting the situation in the future or defending yourself. So, and I think that's important, and it's super cool that you've done this
Yeah.
work to kind of show this goes across culturally. And I'm sure I would put a lot of money on the line to think that this, it's similar states happen across cultures in similarly traumatic situations. And
Yeah.
as you say, Cantor pointed out that you can even see this across species. Learning from traumatic events is super important, clearly. Yeah, and then what we do about treatment. I mean, prevention is always nicer, but it's hard to prevent traumatic events
Yeah.
like this, and that's a complicated
Yeah.
issue. But I have seen
Yeah.
some psychologists say that they use this kind of reference to evolved nature causing this defense response in their therapy, just talking through it with patients, and that's just help them kind of just talk about the problem and understand why they can't sleep anymore, and and maybe just dealing with it in that sense would be helpful. Yeah, I mean it's super important work, and I can really highly recommend anyone who's interested in warfare or PTSD, especially to read the supplementary material. If you really want the insight into the experiences, then the supplementary material, which is available on the PNAS website, has all of these quotes, and it's very moving, honestly. So yeah, thank you for doing that. Is there anything else that you thought you wanted
Yeah.
to cover, or that you thought you would want to
Yeah.
mention as we kind of
Yeah,
wrap up?
I appreciate that. I do. Yeah, I think the one I mentioned too is that I mean I think that there is. Yeah, and thank you for recommending the supplementary material too, because I put a lot of we put a lot of work into trying to cover all our bases there, and I do think that yeah that I just want to appreciate the Turkana people that we interviewed who took the time to talk to us and potentially relive some pretty traumatic things in their life. I also want to say like there's a lot of uh, focusing on combat and death and combat stress is only like one small aspect of Turkana society. There's a lot of great fun and enjoyment and laughter and children play. There's a lot of good there too. I don't want this podcast to cast this as like all doom and gloom type of place to be or society. They're very different in a lot of ways and have very hard lives, and from our perspective, but there is also a lot of good there and a lot of joy. And so I just wanted to make sure that was said in this. Yeah, and the other thing to do is I just want to give a shout out to Sarah and Matthew for helping me come there, and our amazing field assistants and field manager. I do think that there is a good amount of work in medical anthropology and cross-cultural psychology on this topic that a lot of people that are more evolutionary minded might not look into. But I think it's, if you are evolutionary minded, it's good to think about like how the variation in these things across cultures, how do different idioms of distress go? Like insomnia, like you were saying, super common. Probably the most common thing. And then these other hypervigilance maybe also. And so after that, it's some variation. And the last thing I want to say is like I think it's good. There's this great paper, and I don't think it's evolutionary, by Eiko Fried, you may have heard of, but he has this paper called I don't remember the title, but it's something like studying mental disorders as systems, not syndromes, or as symptoms, not syndromes. And I think that's really good to start if you're evolutionary and you want to think about the functions of different symptoms specifically, and maybe not be shackled to this kind of like classification system that the DSM provides. I think that's a useful paper for thinking about that and like how to think about interactions of symptoms, and not this kind of like, if you have so many symptoms over this much, and then you have this disorder, then you don't. I think that's a really fun and useful paper for thinking about it, at least for me as coming in from the outside thinking about these issues. So those are the things I wanted to cover that we didn't get to cover. And I just want to thank you for hosting this. This is super fun. This is my first time doing a podcast, and I had a good time.
Yeah, great. No, thank you. Thank you for coming on. As I say, it's a great paper, and I'm really glad to be able to cover PTSD. Actually, you reminded me talking about the fact that Turkana is obviously not all about warfare. Like that's the specific paper is in combat stress is clearly an important cause of PTSD. But also we should remember that like a lot of PTSD is also not caused by warfare in like Western societies. And I think there's some kind of important there's some important takeaways here, that it's just a generalized response. And most of the people who are experiencing PTSD in the US and the West haven't been to war. It's just they've been in a horrific car accident and now they can't get in the car.
And I think it's interesting to think. I think it's interesting to think about how one thing is like PTSD is the only thing in the DSM that has a cause, right? That requires a cause of some kind. Everything else is just, do you have these symptoms or not? So that's kind of interesting. But also, there's like some work about the different causes, right? Like combat stress might be different in some ways than car accidents or interpersonal violence. Specifically, there seems to be a sense that it's like harder to treat, and it's harder. Like the clinical results are not as well. I don't know if it's harder to treat, but like if you do the same types of therapy with combat stress versus other types. The sense I just talking to VA researchers, they seem to think that it's harder to have recovery for combat stress. And I've had some ideas about that, but I think it's a useful thing to put out there is like in our work, like you said, it's just combat stress is all we focused on. So I don't have much to say about these other things.
Yeah, but I think that there's something important there. These are generalized mechanisms. It's not like we've evolved specific defenses for car accidents. The fact that if you have a really extreme traumatic experience, and combat stress is like the most obvious place to look at that, but very clearly you see similar sort of symptoms popping up, and and it would make sense for this response to generalize. So I think it's important, and it does reflect on much more than just combat stress. PTSD, it's really giving us an insight into why extreme trauma affects us generally. So it's a great example of that. So thank you, and it's really great to cover it. It's a wonderful addition to the podcast. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.